So, what do you do on vacation? When we went out east, we saw some pretty quaint, cool villages. We went up and down some very fascinating mountain ranges. We talked to a lot of people, met a Christian couple off in some sand dunes near some lighthouse. We're now Facebook friends. We talked to people from Ontario. We met people from India. We met people from all over the world. But typically when you're traveling, no matter where you are at in the world, you're probably going to pass some form of memorials. And we did stop and witness several memorials that commemorate certain things that have taken place in our country. Here are some that come to mind. There were a couple interesting war memorials that listed the names of people who have died to secure freedom. There were memorials to fishermen who were lost at sea, bringing in the harvest for people to be able to eat and survive. There was a memorial to the Swiss aircraft crash just off of Peggy's Cove in the late 90s. That was pretty moving to see that. There were memorials to some of the pioneering loyalists who came up from the U.S. after the War of Independence and established various towns and jurisdictions in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick. So lots of memorials. And if you go to a memorial, they're normally made out of something solid, like some hard, almost unmovable object. So they're made out of bronze or granite, or they're carved into some form of stone. And it begs the question, why is it that humans have this need or desire to memorialize past events? Why do we put tombstones on graves? Why do we create war memorials? Why do we erect statues of famous people in public squares? Why do humans have this desire to memorialize and commemorate significant events, significant accomplishments, or significant people? Well, the reason is because when we create a permanent monument, it serves to remind people who will never witness it firsthand, who weren't there, who maybe will be born generations later, of things that we can't afford to forget about. That's why we memorialize significant events, significant people, or significant accomplishments. Life is very short, and you're only going to have a limited number of experiences, a limited number of encounters. You're only going to meet a limited number of people because your life is just a little wedge of time in a very long history. But when we go to memorials, we learn about things or events that took place in the past. We're educated by them. We learn from them. You've heard it said that a person that is ignorant of history is bound to repeat its mistakes. And we see this in our own country, where even many of the political or sociological or cultural ideologies that are being foisted upon us, they're not even new. They're not even original. They've been tried in the past and have failed. And yet ignorance of history causes people to reinvent them, put a little bit different color on them, you reframe them in some different language. But like communism isn't new. Marxism isn't new. Sexual revolutions aren't new. Sexual promiscuity isn't new. The things that are being promoted in our country, they're not new. But if you're ignorant of history, you're bound to repeat its mistakes. And so monuments serve that purpose minimally, to remind us of things that we can't afford to forget. And it also gives us a heightened appreciation for some of the challenges and difficulties and accomplishments that our forebears went through. And not only is this the case with Canadian history and with our tour to the Maritimes, but it's true of our biblical faith. In fact, if you read your Bible, it's not uncommon for us to be called as the people of God to remember certain things that we have never personally witnessed. Think about the purpose of the rainbow, the biblical rainbow. I never witnessed the flood. I wasn't there. I wasn't on Noah's ark. I didn't disembark from the ark, and nor did you. But the rainbow reminds us of a promise. It commemorates an event that is significant in human history. The Lord's Supper. You and I weren't living in the first century. We didn't see Jesus preaching in public and being crucified and being resurrected, and we weren't in the upper room, but the Lord's Supper commemorates that event. The Sabbath commemorates God's rest after 6 days of creation. And here in our passage, in Joshua chapter 4, monuments are going to be built so that future generations will never, ever forget the mighty deeds of God as the nation of Israel exits the Sinai and begins to take control of the land of Canaan. You know, I was thinking about Thomas, the doubting disciple of Christ, who when he heard with his ears that Jesus had been resurrected, he made the mistake that so many of us make. If I can't taste it, if I can't touch it, if I can't smell it, if I can't see it, if I can't hear it, it mustn't be true. Well, if that's the way you're going to live your life, you're going to have a big problem when it comes to your faith, because many of God's deeds, you'll never taste, touch, smell, see, hear, they are from the past. But monuments have been built, and a story's been written, and a history's been recorded that we have access to. And through faith, we read about and we observe these commemorative deeds of God, these commemorative actions of God, and our faith is encouraged by looking backward. So as believers, I want us to be encouraged to see remembering and pausing as a spiritual act. You see, it is a spiritual act to pause and remember the blessings of God, even ones that you personally have not witnessed firsthand. God has been around for a long, long time. Eternity, actually. And he's been working for generations in this old world of ours. And I think we need to do a better job in remembering that and commemorating and reflecting upon his past deeds and then passing his beautiful deeds on to the next generation. So let's get to Joshua chapter 4. Just to set the context a little bit, if you're joining us for the first time today, the nation of Israel, founded by Abraham. Abraham was promised the land of Canaan. He walked its full length and died. A few generations later, the nation that had come from him went down to Egypt because of a famine. They ended up staying there for about 400 years. They ended up enslaved by the Egyptians. Through a series of miracles, God allowed them to exit the land of Egypt. The first formidable barrier was the Red Sea. No problem. God parted it, allowed them across. Then they rebelled against God. So for 40 years, they were punished by wandering around in the Sinai desert. At the end of that event, he now parts the Jordan River. They are now marching across the Jordan River, the whole nation, the priests of the Ark of the Covenant, and they're about to enter the Promised Land. But instead of getting to the work of the ministry, getting their swords out and fighting off the Canaanites, God wants them to pause and take time to commemorate him. In God's timeline, there's always lots of opportunity for worship. It's not a waste of your time to pause and to remember and to memorialize the mighty deeds of God. And so, instead of rushing ahead and quote unquote accomplishing things, the army is asked to pause and remember the accomplishments of God. Did you hear that? Even our lives, it's not just all about accomplishing things for God. We must take ample time to remember the accomplishments of God. This buttresses our faith, galvanizes us, catechizes us, instructs us, and also is a blessing to the next generation. Our entire lives should be, in a sense, I'll use this metaphorically, monuments unto God's goodness. Your life should be a monument unto God's goodness and mercy so that future generations would remember as well what God has done. So here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to read the whole of the 4th chapter. I'll pause here and there and make some comments. And then after we get through the whole chapter, it's going to take a little while. Then I want to share with you 4 things that result from, 4 blessings or 4 instructions that result from remembering, pausing, and considering the deeds of the Lord. So in the first verse, we learn that everyone shows up, and this is a corporate collective experience. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord, that is his covenant name, not a generic name like God here, but his covenant name, said to Joshua. So notice that all the nation, this is a rare example where literally everybody is all in for God. There's nobody rebelling against God. It's a rare example of corporate and individual consecration to Christ, to God. And we know that this is a prerequisite to true blessing and worship. When the whole of God's people at any point in history unite in worship, look out, world, because God is going to move mightily among us. It's a fabulous thing. But of course, the whole is the sum total of the parts. So in order for the whole to be consecrated, the parts need to be, first and foremost, consecrated unto God. And here we have the whole and the parts. So the whole nation, the tribal heads, all the households, everyone participating in this memorialization. The text gives us that information. Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan. So river rocks in the bottom of the Jordan that had been separated, that the people were walking across. So rocks in the bottom of the river, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder. So these were big men. Let's say they were 30, 40, 50-pound stones, and something that was easy to see, according to the number of tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. See, when God moves and works in our midst, we often think of it in terms of spiritual blessings. So internal peace, knowledge of God's word, the work of the Spirit, spiritual giftedness. But God also knows that we are material beings. And often there are material, tangible signs that God gives to us to commemorate his work. And that's okay. It's not just all about thinking, sometimes about seeing something that reminds us of what God has done. God wanted every group, every tribe to have a role in this act of consecration and memorialization of God's mighty deeds among them. This was for everyone. Again, I'll emphasize it. For the whole and for the parts that made up the whole. We could say that God had called every individual, every tribe, and the nation as a whole to serve him and to be a blessing to future generations, reminding them what God has done. And that's really our goal as a church, by the way. The goal of our church is not to prop up clergy and they do all the work and you just kind of sit and observe. It's not to create an inner circle of people who do all the serving and the commemorating, kind of have their act together. We want everyone. We want the whole and we want the parts, the households, the individuals, the movers and shakers, and those of you that are maybe a little bit more unknown to be all in for God. And if we are, we can anticipate that God's going to do some pretty awesome things in our own generation. So let's not make church a spectator sport. And let's not make worship something that's reserved for people on the stage. And let's not make telling the old story strictly the task of the church historians. All of us, the whole and the parts, need to be fully consecrated to the things of God. And notice the generational blessing of that. When your children ask in time to come, "What do these stones mean to you?" then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, so these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. It doesn't take too long before people start to say, I wasn't born when that happened. You know what it's like. I remember as a kid thinking, it's kind of weird when people can say, oh, like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and then here I am out at Peggy's Cove in Prince Edward Island, and I said to someone, I have not been here for 43 or 44 years. And then I felt like really old, because I was there when I was about 7 or 8. I don't remember exactly when. But I can say, I was here like 40 years ago. You start to feel kind of old, right? But the time will come when some of the things we've experienced as a church, the younger generation will have no recollection of them. The pandemic, COVID, what was that all about? Tell me about it. And we can talk about what we learned and how God blessed and how God encouraged us in our response to that. And you have your own story of how God has worked in your life. And the time will come when a new generation will come on and they won't even know about that. And if we don't tell them, if we don't tell the old story, if we don't tell stories from biblical history, our own testimonies, how God has worked in our generation, we're robbing them of an opportunity to know something about God and to worship Him because of it. So here we have a reminder that there's going to be generations that will come that have not witnessed what we have witnessed, and it's our job to tell them. And sometimes we do that through memorials. We often do it through preaching and teaching and the reading of church history. Now, there are some reasons why this is important. I'll get to those once I finish reading the whole chapter. So let's get back into it here at verse 8. And the people of Israel did just as Joshua commanded and took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they lodged and laid them down there. So there was some work involved in this act of worship. I mean, they had to burn some calories and put some effort in. And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan. So notice stones are coming out of the Jordan to build a memorial, and stones are going from the land into the Jordan to build a memorial, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and there they are, and they are there to this day. For the priests bearing the Ark stood in the midst of a Jordan until everything was finished, that the Lord commanded Joshua to tell the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people passed over in haste. And I would suggest, we're not told this, but I'm guessing based on the context, they were kind of excited. This was awesome. This wasn't like, we're scared, but God was working. So they're hasty in the crossing. And when all the people had finished passing over the ark of the Lord, and the priests passed over before the people, the sons of Reuben, the sons of Gad, the half-tribe of Manasseh passed over armed before the people of Israel, as Moses had told them. About 40,000, not from all the tribes, but at least from these 3 tribes, ready for war, passed over before the Lord for battle to the plains of Jericho. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they stood in awe of him, just as they had stood in awe of Moses all the days of his life. Let me just pause here and make this comment. Never under any circumstances should we idolize human beings. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't use key men and key women as his instruments throughout time to accomplish incredible things. So when we study church history or biblical history, we're like, wow, Daniel was pretty awesome. I mean, Paul accomplished some great things for God. Thank God for Martin Luther. Thank God for Ulrich Zwingli. Thank God for John Calvin. Thank God for people throughout history. We're not idolizing them, but we associate events and movements of God with key figures. So this is not, bow down and kiss the sandals of Joshua, but he's being acknowledged as an instrument in God's hands. And then in verse 15, and the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests' feet were lifted up on dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed its banks as before. The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, which means this is a historical event. There's a date on the calendar that commemorates it. This isn't fiction. This isn't some myth. You ever hear people say, the Bible's mythological? Well, if it's mythological, it does a pretty poor job of communicating mythology in mythological language. You don't communicate mythology using dates and facts on a calendar. This is an event that actually occurred on a specific day, an unrepeatable event in human history. And they encamped at Gilgal. So Gilgal, you look at a map and you have the Dead Sea, you have Shittim where they had camped before, they cross it. The first battle is going to be at Jericho. Just to the northeast is a town called Gilgal. So it's a little bit of a hike, not hours and hours and hours, but it's a bit of a hike to haul all those stones eventually up to that location. And they end up crossing the Jordan, and then the water just kind of comes back in around them. And those 12 stones, which they took up out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. So he didn't make it easy on them. Like, they had to carry these big old rocks a bit of a distance. Kind of tells you something about the worthiness of God for us to put some effort in to worshiping him, memorializing his deeds. He's not a pragmatist. He's not trying to make it like super easy. Why take rocks from the shore, put them in the river, rocks from the river, put them on the shore, and then hike them all the way up to Gilgal? Why don't we just go to Gilgal and collect some rocks and then maybe throw some in the river? Put a little work in. Take some time. It's not just about getting the guys into Jericho or conquering the enemy. God is worthy of our calories, of our time, of our talents, of our treasures, as we say, of our temples. He's worthy of the effort. His works are awesome, and we can put some time. We can burn some calories. We can labor for him. This honors him, not just for the desired outcome of building houses and conquering the land and winning a few battles, just taking that time to pause and just do something for God that doesn't necessarily have any direct material or even ministerial development or benefit to you is valuable. Think about that. In a fast-paced world, it's like, I like to make the most of my time. Well, believe it or not, you are making the most of your time when you're taking time to just pause, work and labor, commemorate God's work. It's not just about what you are able to do for him. It's not just about your accomplishments. It's about God's accomplishments being remembered. And he said to the people of Israel, this is the second time we hear this, when your people ask their fathers in times to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know, Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea. So these are the bookend events. Out of the wanderings into the promised land. Out of hell to a place of sojourning to the promised land. Which he dried up for us until we passed over. And then, lest you think that our worship, our commemoration, our remembering, our memorializations of God's work is just for our benefit, to edify us, to train up our children. It's not just that, it's evangelistic. I'll just use New Testament language and port it on the text. It's evangelistic because look at what it says next. So that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, and you may fear the Lord your God forever. So there's two prongs to that. That the people of God would fear him and worship him and know him, and so that everyone else, all these Canaanites, Amorites, Moabites, would see the might of God. Our willingness to pause, to commemorate, to memorialize, blesses us. And it also communicates something important to the watching world. 12 stones are taken out of the river at the point of crossing, and 12 are taken to the river where the crossing occurred. I don't know how they were configured. I don't know how they piled them up or the precise size of the stones, but I'm guessing the ones in the river would have been piled sufficiently high so that at least when the water was low, you could see them. I don't know how long they lasted there until someone tipped them over. But at least for generations, they would serve as a permanent reminder of God's blessing. Stones are, unless it's like sandstone, they don't go anywhere. They're solid objects. How do you date a stone? I mean, they're there for a long time. And these stones are put there as enduring reminders of God's blessings. And this is exactly what God wanted. This wasn't an event he was about to repeat every generation to convince you of his power. But there would be a memorial put there, not to remember other people's names, but to remember the name of God Almighty. We've talked about this. Sometimes you're chatting with people and they're like, I'm not good with names. Okay, well, fair enough. It might hinder your social relationships a little bit if you don't work at that, but you can make it another day without being good at names, remembering people's names. Some people don't remember their anniversaries. So we're out in the Maritimes. I'm a chatty guy. I'm talking to some guy at a gas station. And I mentioned to him, we're from Ontario. He's from Ontario. And I said, yeah, we're here celebrating our 30th anniversary. And he's like, oh, we're here celebrating an anniversary too. Just a second, he says. He walks over and he knocks on the window. He's filling gas. Hey, honey, how many years now? He's like, 35. I said, how do you go on an anniversary trip and not know how many years you're celebrating? Like, I probably wouldn't be here today if I'd have pulled that stunt on Susie. Probably would have been at the bottom of the Bay of Fundy or something. But it's possible, I suppose, to remember an anniversary or forget an anniversary and live another day. There's things we forget, but we should have a very good memory, a very long and consistent memory of God's miracles, God's provision, and God's promises. You know, if you're a Christian, you are by definition a historian. Because we are living at a point in history, but this isn't when God started to work, and this isn't when God's going to stop working. It's not about us. We're just here for a brief period of time. God has been working throughout time. This is why, I didn't make this up, but you've heard it said before that history is his story. It really is. It's about God's work through time, and we need to talk about how God has worked both in what we would call biblical history, throughout church history, and even in our own lives. This should be a regular part of our conversation. Shame on us if we bring up the Reformation to one of our teenage kids in the church that's raised in a Christian home. They're like, I don't know what that is. Never heard of it. Shame on us if we bring up the exile and they're like, I don't know what the exile is. What is that? Like, if we're not doing a good job in at least giving people basic understanding of how God has worked throughout time and commemorating key events, we're not really living in light of the historical aspect that is part and parcel of our Christian faith. We are part of his story, just a small part. Now you'll notice that when the tribes go across, there's a number given, 40,000 soldiers. So that's kind of a big number. And I think the way that's supposed to serve in our reading is, so there's an army. So this then triggers the notion, okay, that means there's going to be a war. And people are going to be swinging swords. And people are going to be fighting. So there's going to be a place for God's people to serve God actively. They're going to be out there fighting. They're going to be doing ministry, if you want to use that language. But first, they need to commemorate the actions of God. So I think this is an important lesson, because if we perceive of the Christian faith merely as just accomplishing things, I just need to accomplish a lot of things for God. I got to do ministry and show up to every event, evangelize every neighbor, and read my Bible regularly, and just do. But I don't take time to just mull over and think about what God has done. I reduce my Christian life merely to its utilitarian aspect. So there's a blessing in pausing and remembering and commemorating. There's work to be done. The 40,000 are going to go in. But right now, they're just chilling out, building memorials, worshiping God, probably having lots of conversations about their time in the Sinai and God's provision and blessing. So let me then, having read this, the whole of the passage, just outline 4 reasons to remember God's mighty deeds, just to kind of put them to you. Like, they're going to be on the screen. These are just 4 things. You can kind of, if you're taking notes, write them down, commit them to memory. Here's the first one. We remember unrepeatable events. God is not a God that has 100 things that he wants to show his power through, and he comes to every generation, just kind of performs his show so we can all see it firsthand. The river bottom, the Bear River bottom, that was a one-time event. The crossing of the river, that was a one-time event. The Red Sea was a one-time event. The Exodus was a one-time event. Daniel in the lion's den, one-time event. Jesus, resurrection from the grave, one-time event. You've never seen it, and I've never seen it. God's not like a traveling entertainer that has this little package of events, shows that he puts on. So there's many times throughout history when God is going to perform miracles, but they're unrepeatable. They're only going to happen once. But that doesn't mean we can forget them, because they're being memorialized, they're being written in the scriptures, they're being written down by church historians. And God is going to work in our generation in a way that if Jesus doesn't come back, he's not going to work necessarily the same way in the next generation. Depending on what part of the world you're from, maybe you're from Asia. You grew up in Asia, and you've seen God do things there that we North Americans have never seen. Or we're in North America, we're seeing God do something that someone maybe in Africa hasn't seen. So God is not doing the same thing in every location, at every point in time, in every generation. So this is why we share, we tell, we commemorate, we memorialize God's work, because many of his works are unrepeatable. Secondly, we remember for the sake of our children. No matter how much you love God, you will not be here forever. Life is short. Life is moving along. Don't you feel it's getting a little faster, older folks? It feels like it's moving along a little. I don't know, maybe clocks are wound up differently, but things are moving by a little bit faster. I'll just admit it, I'm like way over the hill. Right? I have way more life behind me than I do have ahead of me. I mean, unless I live to 104, which is unlikely because of the stress you put on me. I got far more life behind me than I do have ahead of me. And many of you can relate to that. So we have this limited window to tell the old story, to talk about God's work throughout biblical history and church history and in our own lives. This very brief window. I would say in general, we do a pretty good job in telling stories to children. So they come to our Sunday school and we tell them about, Daniel the lion's den, or Joseph's challenges in Egypt, or Jesus' miracles. And then they become teenagers and we kind of stop telling stories. But the Christian life, again, is a historical life. Our faith is rooted in history from creation to the present. And so we should tell of biblical events, of events through church history, of events in our own lives. I'll ask the parents in the room, just think this over. Do your children know your testimony? Have they ever heard you share your testimony of how you came to faith in Christ? Have they heard about some of the challenges to your faith that you've experienced? Have they had an opportunity to hear from their grandparents, if their grandparents are believing, about the challenges, or maybe great-grandparents? Are we telling the next generation about what God has done, or is it one of the best-kept secrets in our own households? Even when you think of your family history, some of us, I don't know what my grandma's maiden name was, no idea. By the way, cool story, when we went to Halifax, so three of my grandparents are all like historic Canadians, but my maternal grandmother was born in England, and we actually went to the pier where she stepped off the boat at Halifax into Canada in 1946, and they have historians there that were able to look up the length of her journey. It took her 21 days to cross the Atlantic on a boat. And this is a 19-year-old girl that never set foot outside of England. I think about 7 days by train to get into Ontario. And it was just kind of cool. They had all the information, the boat she was on, its tonnage, the arrival date. It's kind of neat to think of the history of that. But beyond those maybe more spiritually neutral, benign events, it's an interesting thing to think about. I wonder what the faith of my grandparents was like, or my great-grandparents, or my great-great-grandparents, and how did their challenges, the falsehoods that they believed, or the truth that they embraced, maybe even without me knowing it, trickle down a generation, and another generation, and another generation, and actually have served to shape the way we think. Have you thought much about that? It's interesting to consider how God has worked in our own family lineages. The problem with the modern world is we tend to think so individualistically. We're just about, I want to maximize my life, make as much money, have as much pleasure and accomplish, even in ministry. It's kind of about me, and we're often completely disconnected from our history. This is why biblical genealogies seem weird to most modern Western people. Who cares what the name of your great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy was? Like, why does that matter? Because there was this sense of generational corporate solidarity. You are a product of a long line of historical events that have shaped you in some way, shape, or form, for the good or for the bad, because we live in a sinful world. But when we think in a hyper-individualistic way, we become ignorant of our own history. And then even if we're reading biblical history, we may read history for, well, just give me the takeaway. Okay, so Daniel's in a lion's den. Okay, so then I need to dare to be like Daniel. Okay, well, great. Please be like Daniel. But maybe there's more to that. Maybe that event is set within God's redemptive work throughout history, and it has a broader purpose in the biblical narratives that we need to consider. If you're interested in learning more about church history in particular, I don't often recommend books, but there is a book that I think most of you probably would enjoy. It's probably 20, 25 years old. It's just simply called Church History. You're going to love the title. In Plain Language. And I believe it's Bruce Shelley that wrote it. If you don't have that in your library, get a copy of that. And it's written in a very easy to read way, I think. And it'll just give you a kind of an appreciation for how God has worked in the last couple of thousand years. But if not that book, you don't have to be an expert in church history. I'm certainly not. But to have a basic familiarity with how God's been working in the last 40 or 50 generations, I think is valuable. And then even thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, your family line. So I know, probably like many of you, I have some French Catholics in my background. I have some English Anglicans. I have some English Puritans. I have some secular, I don't want to go to church people in my background. I have some Brethren people in my lineage. People from different faith systems or different denominations who I believe, the more I study my own family history, have shaped the way my grandparents thought and my parents think and I think, again, for the good or for the bad. And being aware of that helps you to sort through, what am I going to retain and what do I want to spit out? So being knowledgeable of history, and then I would say beyond that, maybe just asking a question, if you think of yourself as a person in history, what's your legacy going to be? So few of us, if any of us, are going to have people write biographies about us. Who cares? But you will have a legacy. What is your legacy going to be? Do you think of legacy? What are your physical and spiritual children? How are they going to benefit from your existence? Oh, I'm going to leave them a big inheritance. Whoop-de-doo. They're going to blow it in 2 generations anyway. Or the government will tax it and they won't have it. That's not a legitimate legacy to live for. What is your legacy going to be? What are the lessons that you're going to imprint on the next generation? 3 or 4 generations from now, when your name is forgotten, those lessons will continue to live on in people. It's a cool thought to think that you have the capacity, as you serve God, to be influencing people potentially hundreds of years from now, long after you're gone. What is your legacy going to be? Is your life going to be a memorial unto God? Or is it going to be squandered? Godly people think about future generations, and they love to tell God stories, and they love to issue warnings. Been there, done that, tried that. Even with heresy is false teaching. The heresies that the modern church is experiencing, they're not new. I don't know of any modern heresy that's new. It's just a repackaged heresy from the past that we already wrestled to the ground and kicked to the curb, and someone has reinvented. And if you study history and you understand a lot of the heresies the church had to overcome, it's easier to see them in the present. Like, I know what that is. I know what that is. That's the old Arian heresy or whatever it might be, the Galatian heresy. And you're able to deal with it. So we tell stories and we issue warnings. Third, we remember to memorialize God's covenants. We want to remember God's covenants, okay? Like, what is a covenant? It's God's promises and dealings with his people. Put it to you simply. Now, Joshua 4 is not about a new covenant that God is making, but it is about a partial and further fulfillment of a covenant that he made to Abraham back in Genesis 12 to give them the land. So centuries had gone by, but the fact they're now on the land, everybody's safe and secure, this is a further fulfillment of God's covenants. God has always worked through covenants. I mean, you think of the Noahic covenant, and there's a sign attached to it, a rainbow, something you can see to remind them of the covenant. The Abrahamic covenant, circumcision, something kind of obvious to remind them of the covenant. The new covenant, the Lord's Supper. This is my covenant, new covenant in my blood. We drink from the cup, we eat from the bread to remind ourselves, using a physical, material thing, of God's covenant. And this is how God works. We are material beings. Waters parted at the beginning and the end of the Sinai. Physical things that they could remember of God's deliverance. And now they have stones on permanent land, and they have stones in the river as permanent reminders. Now, not all covenants are the same, but God does keep his covenants. God's covenant to Abraham, he didn't kick it to the curb. I mean, we've been grafted in. If you read Romans 11, we have the true vine, we have the true branches. The vines fail to bear fruit. We're the wild olive shoots. We're grafted onto the vine. So we get to participate in the blessings of Abraham and become spiritual children of Abraham. But God also has a plan for the physical offspring of Abraham, I believe. In Romans 11:25-26, it says a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And that way all Israel will be saved. So there's a spiritual dimension to this because there is a spiritual Israel. But it seems to me that God still has some plan for the physical offspring of Abraham in the moment to bring them into the new covenant, but also to set his focus on them, to bring them into relationship with him in the end times. Now, this is not to be conflated for the spiritual or rather the political situation in Israel today, but I'm mentioning all this not only to maybe whet your appetite to study that topic further, but just to mention that God keeps covenant. And so we memorialize covenants because God keeps covenant. We participate in events to remind ourselves that God keeps covenant. So memorializing events serve to remind ourselves of the covenantal nature of God. So we're not just memorializing events. This is the point I want to make. We're not just memorializing an event. Oh, that was a cool event. They crossed the Jordan. Oh, they're in the promised land. Who would have thought it? It's not just the event, but it's the covenant under which the event is part that we're memorializing. Fourthly and finally, we remember to point people to the God who is worthy of our worship. So God often uses physical signs or physical events to point us to him or to remind us of his salvation. So here we'll give you an example of this. They're in the desert. They're rebelling against God. The snakes come in. Everyone's getting bit and dying of snakes. Make the bronze serpent, hold it up, look to the serpent, and you'll be healed. Who's doing the healing? The bronze serpent or God? God, obviously. But the problem is they kept the bronze serpent. They named it Nehushtan. And later in the Old Testament, you read about them idolizing Nehushtan. I actually wrote my Hebrew exegesis paper in seminary on that event. They're idolizing Nehushtan, the bronze serpent, and not the God that gave them the serpent and gave them the deliverance. And this is the challenge. There's a cross. It's a symbol of an event. We're not up here worshiping and bowing down to the cross, throwing holy water on it, kissing it. But sometimes Christians forget that the sign is not the reality, and they start to worship the object and not the God who gave us the object. And this has been a challenge. I think it's a challenge in Eastern Orthodoxy. I think it's a challenge in the Catholic Church. They often conflate objects, pictures, images, and make them objects of worship, and that's massively problematic. But in the evangelical church, sometimes we let the pendulum swing the other way, and we're like, no, it's wrong to wear a cross on your neck because that's an idolater. It's not idol. It's a reminder. We got a cross hung up in our church. Got crosses all across the front of our building. I think at least 3 of them, maybe 4, along the front of our building. We're not out there worshiping them, but it's a symbol that reminds us of Jesus' work on the cross. So we mustn't worship the object, but it's very acceptable for us to have symbols, signs, objects, even logos, I guess, to remind us of spiritual realities. Memorials serve to remind us, physical, tangible actions, stories written down by biblical writers, by church historians, to remind us of the event or the events that God has accomplished. And so I think it's bad argumentation, frankly not helpful to strip churches of all symbols, lest people worship them. Symbols and signs often serve a higher purpose, and they can be quite beneficial. Here are some ways that we might want to consider this in our own context. First of all, I hope you're aware by now that in our Canadian history, which is largely Christian, our forebears saw fit to take scripture verses and carve them into our parliament buildings. I wonder how many people that go there and pass godless laws today even know that. But in our parliament buildings in Ottawa, there are all kinds of scripture references. Psalm 72:1, Psalm 72:8, Psalm 127:1, even Ephesians 6:13 on our parliament buildings to commemorate certain truths that are part of our founding history. In our homes, we put scripture texts up. Maybe we erect crosses to remind our guests, to remind ourselves, to remind passerbyers that we're Christian, that we're under God. We used to have some gates out front before we reconfigured our whole parking lot. I stole one of them. Not really, we pulled it out and didn't have need for it, but I actually have it along the front of my property, and I like having it there. It's a big gate, so you can drive big tractors or whatever you want in and out of there. But it has a cross on it, and it's black, but I painted the cross white because I want people driving by to say, oh, this is a Christian home. Now, they're going to look at the cross, maybe look over at the cattle. I don't want them worshiping the cattle. It's not like, oh, holy cow. You know. But I want there to be evidences, external evidences on my property, in my home, in my life, that I'm a Christian. I'm not worshiping those things, but they do point to something that's important. And I'm just green lighting you to do the same. So personally, in our homes, memorialize God. Tell of his stories. Erect symbols and signs to remind people of who you are. But most important, let's think about our own life story and just ask ourselves, is my life story a memorial unto God? And let's hope that they are. Let's hope that each of our life stories, if you're a Christian, that your life story is a memorial unto God, that the way you live, that story, testifies to the might of God in your life. You only have one life to live. Don't squander it on worthless temporal pursuits. So tempting for us to preach that way, and I don't want to be that kind of a guy, but then we go out and we live that way. We're Christians on Sunday, but effectively we're materialists Monday to Friday. Let's not be that kind of a people, but let's live our lives as a memorial unto God, and may our lives bear witness to our children. And if you don't have your own physical children, fine, your spiritual children then, the people you disciple. May your life bear witness to them of the miraculous, wondrous deeds of God. Make that a passion, a desire that directs and guides, like a rudder on a ship, that directs and guides how you live your life, how you speak, how you tell the old story of God's work among us.